A demon is defined as an evil spirit or devil, especially one thought to possess a person or act as a tormentor in hell. Granted, you may not have guessed that definition given the portrayal of demons in many of the video games and popular media that are happening nowadays. Surprisingly sympathetic portrayal of evil here. Demon Turf is a 3D platformer developed by Fabraz, most known for Planet Diver and Slime Son, and probably mispronounced by me, and comes out today, November 4th, 2021, for the price of $24.99. It's available on the Nintendo Switch, the PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox One X, and the PC on Steam, the Epic Games Store, and GOG. That's a lot of platforms to release on at once, but for the purposes of this review, the game was played on Steam. And before I begin, this key was obtained from the developer, Fabraz, and the PR company associated with them for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? I'm going to start this review with setting a tone. Demon Turf surprised me. It's not that I didn't think the game would be good. Looking at the trailers and media before doing this review, I expected a solid platformer that would probably hiccup here and there. What I didn't expect was some of the depth that the game would provide, and how different it would feel from other 3D platformers I'd play over the last several years. Not to say that it doesn't have familiarity in the genre. Those who have played the 3D Mario games will immediately feel at home here, and it's who will end up benefiting from the game the most that may surprise everyone in the end. Let's start with the basic premise. You're Beebs, a demon who wants to rule the gangs of the world of Forktown and overthrow the Demon King. With your supporters Midgie and Luce, you make your way through several different worlds to take over the gangs of different areas, to build up your strength and get ready for that Demon King fight by collecting batteries. Yes, batteries. I admit, I still don't know why it's batteries, and I'm pretty sure Beebs is not constructing an army of Energizer Bunnies. Granted, the main other collectibles in the game are currency such as lollipops and cake, but for some reason, that makes sense with Beebs as she says nom 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 every time you eat one. You do that by making your way through each of the levels in the subworld, which has one intro level, 6 levels within it, and a boss level. In the non-boss levels, you have 3 cakes defined as a secondary currency, along with battery. In the boss level, you'll earn a new skill, and after you beat the boss, you get those initial 7 levels remixed a bit, with a new battery and 50 lollipops to earn. So if you're looking for main game levels, Demon Turf is going to bring the content in that area, as there's enough here for 10 to 15 hours without the side content in order to beat the game. But when it comes to the side content, you're looking at more like 30-35. But more on that later. The goal of each non-boss level is to get to the end of the course. I mean, it's a platformer. Avoiding traps and jumping over hazards along the way. Your basic skill set will be familiar to those who have played the 3D Mario games. You've got a regular jump, a second jump if you hit the ground that gives you a tiny bit more air. You've got a wall jump, although a bit more perpendicular than the more flexible Mario one. You've got a spin in the air that can float you down slowly as time goes on as well. In addition, you'll get skills such as the ability to fling yourself off floating platforms like you saw in Wind Waker a little bit, turning into a rolling snake to get up steep inclines, and even being able to slow down platforms with a magical bullet. However, one of the things that I will repeatedly refer to in this video is that Demon Turf feels like a familiar new version of a 3D platformer. I know, new and familiar, sounds like a walking contradiction, but hear me out. See, you have 3D Mario moves here. You have elements you may recognize being influenced from games like Wind Waker. Hell, there's some oddly specific in-media references where I wonder if the team is coming awfully close to a copyright dispute. However, gameplay-wise, there are some slight alterations here. Take the spin move. Depending on when you put it in the sequence of jumps, you can get different effects. Put it at the end of the sequence, you have more control on your landing to make those precision landings, especially on moving platforms. But if you want to get the most distance out of Beebs, you put it in the middle, as it gives you extra distance with one of the longest jumps in the game. Now of course, there was something similar in Mario games of the immediate past, and I'll admit that it felt like the differences were more pronounced in this version for doing the different jumps, especially with that distance playing. And it worked well here in giving the game a bit of its own feel separate from the game it was obviously influenced by. It gave it its own identity, and sometimes with these platformers, that can go a long way. These controls may take a tiny bit getting used to, and they can have their small faults here and there. Take the turnaround jump for example. I found myself at times struggling to get the move to go off to get that little bit of extra height. And part of me thinks that the window of the angle it considers a turnaround jump is pretty tight. But I also must admit that part of this may have to do with my hands hurting a bit from other work, and that I may be off in terms of the actual execution. But when it comes to the movement, especially when moving with a brisk pace, everything felt right for the gameplay that the game was built around. There was a consistency that I could pull off on a regular basis, and even in new areas, I could seemingly make long jumps with ease once I really got the timing of the jump down, while still allowing for slight adjustments to refine landing on the platform. However, that refinement wasn't so large that it wouldn't punish me for being overly reckless, as I would then fall to reset at a checkpoint on a regular occasion. There are things that you'll have to teach yourself that may not make sense at a first glance, and sometimes the game does not exactly give you a good introduction to a particular skill and its quirks. I don't know how many times I died in this boss fight on these platforms due to the fact that double jumping after throwing yourself up with this skill meant you couldn't grab the next platform with the tool again. Double jumping there just felt so natural to do, you know? But most everything else does feel natural in its implementation. Well, mostly. There's some weirdness with the glide too, specifically getting enough height on the jump to make some of those glide jumps seem to give me problems on a regular basis. And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure why. I had to take my time on them, and part of that may have to do with the camera, making sure I didn't accidentally angle it down at any point, because that will point you to the ground and you'll go to the ground faster. Speaking of which, the camera is one of the most critical elements of a 3D platformer, and Demon Turf nails it for the most part. It helps that the game gives you an option between an auto camera, which can do the job for a good amount of situations, but manual control you can flip to on the fly to really refine your gameplay. The default manual camera implementation was just right for me in giving me enough sensitivity to quickly adjust the camera to a new angle without feeling disorienting. But for those wanting a little more control, the game gives you options to adjust the sensitivity to really hone in on your perfect implementation. Now note, I played the entire game with a controller, and while the mouse controls that I did try didn't seem to be a problem for me, I must admit that my bias of playing with a controller on a 3D platformer means that I'm not the best to answer that particular question, so you may want to watch another review or two in that case. But controls are only a part of this equation, and mean nothing if the level design isn't taking advantage of them. And that's where Demon Turf may shine the brightest. Levels do a great job of throwing different jumps, hazards, and problems to overcome without feeling like a chore around 98% of the time, which is pretty big compared to other platformers I've played. Again, many of the elements here will be familiar, from rotating platforms on loops to fans that will propel you up airwise. A lot of the typical hazards from other games are here, but it's the way that the game combines those hazards and base design in conjunction with the controls that puts Demon Turf's unique stamp on the genre. First, you're not getting levels that feel repetitive here. You may jump into a level where you have to defeat a series of enemies on an island to open up a series of keys, having a little bit of open exploration while trying to figure out what key you're missing. Then you may jump into a train car level that has you judging the timing of making your way to the next train while not slamming into the walls of a tunnel. Then you may have to climb a large tower where one false move takes you back to your last checkpoint, as everything around you is a death pit. While individual elements of exploration, movement, and mastery of controls are tested here, I was really surprised at how these levels never felt the same from one to another. That's even including when the levels get remixed after you face a boss. Alternate paths and new challenges are inserted to actually make you want to see the same level again. What's great about the design here as well is players who are more skilled and more observant will be able to take advantage of a lot of the design here, but that won't lock out other players in the process. Sure, I can go up this platform the normal way, but if I notice the little structure right here, I can avoid jumping all around and shave 20 seconds off my level time, which can get me closer to a trophy at the end of the level. It also helps that the game's level design doesn't force an optimal strategy when it comes to the use of the controls that applies to the entire game, which is frankly something I see a lot of in the indie 3D platforming games that they struggle with. You can't just take advantage of one jump here, even if it's the far distance jump and you're, building up speed, because the game will throw platforms at you that will be near impossible to hit if you use them, unless you've mastered them down to a pinpoint precision. And even then, it's better to use the other tools in your arsenal. It's clear that the developer refined their game with a fine-tooth comb, and it shows in the final product. Let's also not mince any words here. Demon Turf, in my opinion, is not a game for those looking for an easier time. Even veterans of the genre will need to take their time to figure out the best way to get through areas. And I wouldn't say that newer players to the genre should shy away from this game, but they'll have a bit more frustration than their colleagues when it comes to facing Demon Turf's challenges. Levels can seem long even if they're only 8 minutes in length, mostly because figuring out how to best travel over an area and tackle it can be some trial and error of making assumptions of if a certain jump is the right move for this area. The game can feel unforgiving, especially with the way it's structured too. Each base area you have to complete the challenge before the boss unlocks. There's no optional levels here in that case. In addition, to unlock the Demon King, you need 50 batteries, and with all the levels in the game, you only get 56 batteries to work with. Now, there are ways to steal batteries from a level using secondary currency, but it will feel like a cheat a tiny bit. And frankly, it can feel like a struggle to determine whether to use that or not if you're making it halfway through a level and keep dying over and over again. But you do have some tools at your disposal here, and one of the most unique elements of Demon Turf is the checkpoint system, a self-creating checkpoint system. So in each level, you have 3 flags that you can put down on typical surfaces. Flat areas, areas not with traps. You can't just put it in the air, for example. If you die, you will respawn at the last flag that you put down, which can really help to shorten the longer trips when you die, especially in the more vertically extended levels. However, where the big catch here comes is that you only have 3 flags to place down, and you may not know when is a good time to place a flag. See, once you put a flag down, you can't pick it up, and thus getting halfway through a level and actually not having a new flag to put down could be a problem. Implementation-wise, I love this. You have to weigh the risk of throwing one down if you think a section coming up could be a problem, and it can make all the difference in being more aggressive in your movement with that safety net, which can be necessary with some of the jumps that the game throws at you. Now, it's not as simple as putting it at the 1/4, 2/4, 3/4 mark through a level. Some places you'll breeze by, while others you want to put it down literally 1,000 feet from where you started. And that can be the right choice in that situation. And frankly, you may not know what the 1/4, 2/4, 3/4 mark is. Yeah, you can base it off the level length in terms of the trophy time, but frankly, that's not a very good judge. The additional challenge here can also come from the fact that Beebs would have a 1 in the Constitution stat if this were a typical RPG, because one damaging hit means you're starting over at the last checkpoint. Yep, you heard me, 1 hit. And let's have that idea transition us into the combat of the game. The combat may be a little different than what you'd expect. See, Beebs and some enemies don't have the firepower to actually hurt each other. Yes, you have a fist you can throw at an enemy, and the charged talk to the hand attack as well. But you and your opponent only take damage if you touch something like lava, a bullet, fall into a bottomless pit, or a deadly spike. Which means that combat is more about knocking back your opponent with abilities and staying away from deadly hazards and not getting knocked in yourself. Demon Turf's combat, unlike many of its peers, feels like it complements the movement system and feels like an appropriate challenge than a lot of the other indies in the genre when it comes to synergizing with the overall platforming. With the emphasis being entirely on positioning to push back your opponent, or using the world design to move an enemy along a surface to knock them off a platform or into spikes, it uses its platforming tools in combination with the combat, while evolving it with the additional skills to unlock in later levels. Granted, there is a lacking oomph factor to it. You're at the mercy of how enemies move at times, and while you can always reposition yourself, there is a frustration when an enemy seemingly loses just enough momentum to miss a spike. The physics engine here can also be weird at times too, where a simple hint from your hand can cause something to go flying in one case, but charging up the hand and hitting it can seemingly be less effective, but more consistent. It's a little bit weird and it takes a while to get used to. I think that design is purposeful. The fact is, you're charging up, you're trying to focus, and you're wanting it to do the same thing every time. But I admit, especially with some of the soccer games, maybe not necessarily combat, it can feel weird where you touch it and the ball just goes, woo! As for the boss fights, it's another weird shift here. Usually boss fights are a test of your skills that you've learned over a period of time before the fight. However, in Demon Turf, you're given a new skill right at the start of the fight, which will be key in defeating the boss. Granted, you still have elements that you have learned before the match that are still important, but the added challenge of learning a new skill does give the boss fight a different edge. Now, they are challenging in the right way, forcing you to use your movement abilities and positioning in different ways to counter what the boss is throwing at you. They are also the ones that can be difficult and frustrating, mostly because of the one-hit problem and having to redo sections over and over again. And in this case, the checkpoint system is determined by the game and not you. Now, I like the bosses here. There's a good mix-up in how it goes about things, but I will say that there were points in the game I got most frustrated, as learning on the fly about your new ability in a boss fight I don't think had the intended impact that the developer was hoping for, but it was satisfying in the end, so I have to give it that. Now, I mentioned that the game has 10 to 15 hours of core content, but when it comes to the overall game and collectibles and side content, that's another bullet point on the Demon Turf's best of list. There's a lot of side content here. In fact, there's almost too much of it that it can be a little bit intimidating, not gonna lie. You got things like quests where you can use an in-game camera to get specific pictures, and it's nice that the game gives you a lot of options with the camera, such as selfies and filters. You've got side activities like battle arenas to combat enemies, and the aforementioned Demon Hockey Soccer, yes, Demon Hockey Soccer, to push a ball towards a goal. There's cartridges and an arcade to find as well, along with secondary currency to buy pets, cosmetic coloring for Beebs, and abilities to enhance particular elements of Beebs, such as running a little faster or giving an extra control on the spin. That extra content definitely will extend the life of the game in many ways, and each of them are given enough attention where they feel like a reasonable addition to the game, and not just another bullet point for a store page. What I also want to draw attention to and admiration to is that Demon Turf understands that a player may not always want to use the hub world in order to do some of these side activities, or even carry them to the next level. So there's an in-game pause menu option that can quickly take you to a level, or even an area in the hub world that's really easy to use. And it's nice that the developer understood little things like being able to see photo locations, descriptions for quests in the pause menu, so people wouldn't be traveling back and forth unnecessarily. Speaking of the world itself, the presentation of Demon Turf is going to be something that, in my opinion, is going to be very hit and miss when it comes to the general gaming public. It's not that the game doesn't have a lot of love and thought put into its presentation. In fact, it feels rather unique. The dark outlining of characters and the movement of what is basically a 2D drawing in a 3D world does somewhat remind me of games like Paper Mario. But again, Demon Turf feels just a little bit different in how the animation plays out on things like Beebs simply running. There's a roughness to the animation that actually works rather nicely here. Let me explain. What I mean is that if you slow down the animation, you may start to think that there's not a lot to the animation at times, despite the drawing elements. But on the contrary, it feels rather eye-catching when in full speed and motion. The designs of most elements are rather simple despite having good details, like dirt kicking up when you're moving on it. And there's no problem in recognizing one element to the next, even if things like the dirt will start to feel just like a texture more than an in-game element of the world. But where I think the game can be off-putting at times is the effects, and in particular, the lighting. I don't want to say that Demon Turf has Michael Bay levels of bloom at times, but things like spike boxes having this almost chrome nature to them can feel off-putting. The game's darks feel dark in areas like a sandstorm-ridden area, but then you see some light out of a window, and it can feel very unnatural in a lot of ways. This does give a sense of atmosphere and definition from one world to the next, however, so that's why I'm a bit conflicted on it at times. But I do wish that some of the effects, like a chill effect or the poison effect on screen, had a little bit more sharpness to it. Sound design, in my opinion, is the weakest part of Demon Turf. And no, not the voice acting, but the actual sound design. It's nice that I hear little chains when grabbing with the hookshot, for example, but when a big boss slams his fist on the ground and I hear nothing, I admit I just sit there wondering what kind of impact that would have had with it. Yes, spinning around a platform will give a noise, but the clicking doesn't feel like it belongs with what's going on. An alarm can go off and feel substantial, and a spin in the air gives a nice indication when it's done. But the big thing here is that sounds, when they aren't here, really stand out. It's honestly a game that could have been taken to the next level with more oomph in the sound design to really set the stage. Take a listen and hear, and not hear, what I'm talking about. Voice acting is present in the game, and for the most part, it's passable. I don't expect too much out of a smaller game, but Beebs has a tone to her that's cute, yet not too annoying. I love Midgey's voice actor as he really gives it his all and has the energy, but some of the bosses could really give a little bit more oomph in their performance, as certain inflections and use of, accents don't feel right here. It's something that adds a nice touch, but is something that really is there and I won't remember in a week. But take a listen and hear what I'm talking about.
Luce, can you believe it? I've beaten 2 turf.
What the heck is wrong with you?
Wait, but
Do you have any idea what you're doing? Any idea at all? Boss is furious.
But I told you I'd do it. I thought you were backing me up.
No, I wasn't. I thought you were joking. Or at the very least, I never imagined you could actually beat Fredo and Dan for real.
Well, would you look at this? You actually managed to get me to duel you. Well, ain't gonna be much of a duel, eh?
Is that so, big guy? Well, I'm up for some bacon. Time to get this party.
You're gonna regret this, shrimp.
Whoa!
Right? This city rocks.
We should hit the arcades later. No distractions. We gotta clear this zone first before we can tackle the next ones again, Beebs. Huh?
No distractions. Roger, sir.
Music, on the other hand, does stand out, and in a great way. The game has this underlying laid-back rebellion theme that somehow perpetuates itself through the music, but mixes with a variety of instruments and tones that remind me of jazz and funk, without necessarily being in those genres. The game captures action moments with the music rather nicely, especially in boss fights. And while this isn't music that I may listen outside the game necessarily, it fits the game's situations rather nicely. It's thematic to each area and really complements the gameplay, which is what you really want in a music selection for this indie platformer. Take a listen and hear what I'm talking about.
Nuh-uh.
I should also talk about the characters and the story, and I'm gonna be honest here, it wasn't necessarily the biggest of draws. Like, there's a lot of writing and minor characters that are here, and frankly, I wanted more out of the main cast, especially Beeb's sidekicks. Like, it was nice to get a sense of the back and forth with some of the gang leaders within the game levels. And while you may not know a lot about Beebs and why she wants to beat the Demon King at first, you get behind her thanks to her personality. Granted, storytelling in platformers is tricky, and never the main focus of the game, and it did enough to thematically connect your actions in the end to the story. However, your sidekicks not really showing up in these worlds and feeling really disconnected at times, despite being your close friends, was hard to explain. Granted, there is a story with Lucy that plays out here that is nice, and you get things after the boss fights, but for some reason, I ended up wanting a lot more than I got from a plot perspective. Really, the game likes its clever jokes and puns, and made me laugh on occasion, especially with some of the in-game minions you run across. There's a nice revelation or two in the plot, but if you're expecting something like Yooka-Laylee or Banjo-Kazooie in writing in these side characters, I think you're going to be disappointed. You're really relying on the hub world to get a lot of that meat, and frankly, with the emphasis on gameplay that there was, I just didn't feel like spending as much time there. But there is potential for the future here, and frankly, I want to see more of this world. Finally, let's talk about performance, specifically for the PC version. The game does hit 60 FPS, 1080p on this specs of a laptop, and it didn't have a lot of frame drops on the PC, at least for me. I did also play on my main PC, which specs are listed here, and frankly, the game ran fine. Granted, I did see drops here and there while recording on my laptop, but on the flip side, that only seemed to happen with, well, recording footage and specific situations. When turning off the recording, everything was fine. It does seem to have more of a problem when there's a lot of effects on screen. Luckily, you have a large options menu to really refine the performance of your game, along with customizing the game for you. Having simple things like putting your name if you're streaming on the screen is nice, and for speedrunners, the game definitely seems like it's got you, covered options-wise at least. I mean, just look at the sheer amount of options here. You really can't beat it in my opinion. There's a lot, and it's obvious that the developer wanted to make everyone feel comfortable with their game with this level of options. Now again, this is the PC version, so when it comes to other versions, please be advised that you should look at other reviews for that performance, especially considering the game launched on so many platforms at once. Sadly, history of multi-level platform games in terms of releasing all at once doesn't necessarily have a good history in terms of all games hitting it, but it does happen. In the end, Demon Turf feels designed with the influences of platformers of the past, but remixed in a way that gives the game a unique identity and something that you should definitely grab if you like platforming games at all. While the game can have some frustrating moments, you will feel accomplished when you finally grab that battery for a level, as you mix up masterful controls and abilities to take on each unique challenge. A lot of the drawbacks of the game are minor in nature, and while the game can be difficult, it doesn't feel too oppressive thanks to certain options available. There are points where I feel the game could have shined itself just a tiny bit more, especially in the in-game story and sound design. But what you have here is a 3D platformer that reminds me a lot of A Hat in Time in a lot of ways. A game that people will get behind, love, and want to complete fully. That's why Demon Turf gets an 88 out of 100 for me, making it a solid buy, unless you're hurting for cash. This does not, however, include my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective elements of games and tries to match a game to you. If you fall into one of the following categories strongly, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game lies in the buyability range for you. As mentioned, while I don't think the game necessarily will be friendly to newcomers of the genre, those veterans of the genre should be salivating at this game and what it has to offer. And quite frankly, the game obviously comes from a developer that really has learned from their past and really taken the effort to push the game to the next level. Coming up next on the channel will be a shorter review. I know, I actually do those too, of Unpacking probably early next week. You can catch more indie coverage of games you've never heard of on my Twitch in the description below. I will be playing Ziggurat 2 tonight, and I will ask you to like the video if you felt it was worth your time, and dislike it, and maybe leave a comment on why you felt that way and how it could be improved if that's the case. I admit that lately, I've been questioning my review videos and YouTube as a whole if it's worth it in the bigger picture. So any feedback right now would be nice to hear. I've been doing this a long time. Given the work I put into these reviews, sometimes seeing the lower view count and subs can start to get to you. I mean, I do this as a side hobby now, so it helps any little bit to get that input. Nevertheless, I will see you next time, and as always, keep on gaming.